All right. Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's third edition of Women in Literature Festival. It is an absolute pleasure that I welcome uh, all my esteemed guests here for the Yoda Press panel. And I'll begin with the introductions. Arpita Das is the founder, publisher of the award-winning indie publishing house based in New Delhi, India, Yoda Press. She is also senior writing fellow and visiting faculty at Ashoka University and a board member of Publish Her. Anuradha Kumar was born in Sambalpur, Odisha, and has lived in various places in India and elsewhere. She now lives in New Jersey with her family. Her first novel, Letters for Paul, appeared in 2006 and was published by Maplelit, Ahmedabad. She has since then written 10 novels, including 3 works of historical fiction under the pseudonym of Aditi K, if I'm not pronouncing it incorrectly.
Okay, bye.
The Hottest Summer in Years was published in 2021 by Yoda Press, and her work of nonfiction, One Man, Many Lives, Bhagwan Singh and the Early South Asians in America, appeared last year from Yoda Press and Simon & Schuster, India. Anu has also written for young readers. Her most recent books are Kings and Queens of India and Her Name Was Freedom, 35 Fearless Women Who Fought for India's Independence. She also writes regularly for Scroll.India. She studied history in Delhi University and has a degree in management from the XLRI School of Business and an MFA in writing from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. So welcome, Anuradha.
Thank you for having me.
Fehmida Zakeer is an independent writer with bylines in several publications, including The Hindu, The National News, Al Jazeera, Reader's Digest, Himmel, South Asian, National Geographic, Whetstone Magazine, NPR. Her fiction has appeared in publications such as the Indian Quarterly, Out of Print Magazine, Quarterly Literary Review Singapore, Asian Cha, among others. A story of hers was placed first in the Himmel South Asian Short Story Competition in 2013, and another was chosen by the National Library Board of Singapore for the 2013 edition of their annual Read Singapore Anthology. Recently, her translation of celebrated Malayalam writer B.M. Zohra's memoir titled The Dream of a Mapilla Girl was published by Sage Yoda. Welcome, Fehmida.
Thank you, Sabin. Thank you, Arpita.
Sorry about that. Namita Waikar is the author of the novel The Long March. She is co-founder and managing editor at the People's Archive of Rural India, where she also writes for and anchors the Grindmill Songs Project. At present, she is working on a nonfiction book on the farmers' protests forthcoming with Melbourne University Publishing. She's a partner in a chemistry database in a chemistry databases firm in Pune, a culmination of her work of about 20 years as a biochemist and a software project manager. Welcome, Namita.
Thank you, Sabine. Thanks, Arpita.
Sehyr Mirza is a journalist who has used her voice to advocate for women's equality, peace, and security. Her campaign against hate speech in internet spaces has raised awareness for the communalities of the perception of ordinary citizens on complex peace contexts. Sehyr Mirza is also the co-founder of the Society for Advancement of Makers, Arts, and Justice, Samaj, an organization that uses mass, mixed media, and communication to advocate for issues around conflict, justice, and gender. So welcome, Sehyr. And over to you, Arpita.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So I'm thrilled to have all 4 of you here. And this feels like I'm chatting with all of you over cups of coffee. Well, I don't have an office anymore. As you know, Yoda Press went remote during the lockdown, but we are quite happy to have done that. We feel lighter and we feel more proactive somehow having done that. I'm going to ask my first question. I'm going to pose my first question to Anu, because I think if we look at it chronologically, although all the books have come out and Namita's, of course, is yet to come out, it's over the last year. I think Anu's came out first. And with Anu, we've also done 2 books. And I thought I wanted to get her to talk a little bit about both the books first. So Anu, I want to start you off with the hottest summer in years, and how, when we first met and talked about this book and you sent me the first manuscript, in a sense, you were approaching literary fiction for the first time. You said that, I was writing in the literary fiction genre. I haven't done it very often. It's something that I'm experimenting with this book. So do you want to take us back a little bit to that time? Because you were already this very well published, prolifically read author, and you came to this small press with this absolutely marvelous novel, very much in the literary fiction genre. What was the process like? Was it very different from writing your other books at that time? What was it like?
Well, it's going to be a long answer, and most of it will be very impetuous and spontaneous. So I hope that's okay.
That's fine.
I'm very happy to be here with all of you. People I've read and heard about. So yeah. So okay. The hottest summer in years is something like I've told Arpita. I started work on about 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And there have been other novels, children's work and other novels too. But like most of my novels have been sort of cross-genre novels. And I've always had a problem explaining things to publishers, like even with my first novel, Letters for Paul, and then came Dollmaker's Island, which was when I first met Arpita, because we had a reading at the lovely bookshop she owned. Yoda came. So Dollmaker's Island happened, and then It Takes a Murder, which Hachette brought out in 2012. So, the kind of works that bent genres or cross genres. It Takes a Murder, its title shows, had a crime in it, but it was also, it tended to get into literary fiction. But for the life of me, when I tried to explain to the big publishers what's it about, I found it difficult because I couldn't explain. I was supposed to slot myself into a certain category, a certain genre. And so when I worked on The Hottest Summer, which also had a kind of personal history behind it, because I had lost my father and he worked in Odisha where this novel is set. So after he passed away, I thought this novel started speaking to me in a more urgent way. And I wanted to write the novel much as I envisaged it. And of course, it changed along the way in the course of a decade and more. But when I started talking to Arpita about it, to you about it, I think there was an emotional connect also we shared, because I think we lost our fathers around the same time. Yeah. And, I found that connection of heart and mind, just very soothing, and I felt comfortable in that space, and I felt you understood what I was trying to do with this novel, that it kind of brought everything together, that you couldn't just call it a murder novel. It had a crime and it had history. It was still literary. And I found that my experience with small indie presses more comfortable that way, because they get a writer. They understand what a writer is trying to say, instead of trying to look at the market, at what the readership prefers at that particular moment in time. So so that was the beginning of how The Hottest Summer in Years came about. It's
okay. I find it really interesting that you pointed out that the book was historical fiction and a murder mystery, and also literary fiction. And absolutely, it was kind of cross genres in that sense. And if I move to your other book, which we did in collaboration with Simon & Schuster India, One Man, Many Lives, which is narrative nonfiction. But even when I was editing that book, I had this sense of it being cross-genre, because it is as much about the history of a particular figure or two people, or the history of a particular community in a part of the world, as much as having a sense of a thrilling quest, because I think that is the tonality in which you like to write. Would I be correct in saying that?
Oh yes, yeah, yes, and also it was about a marginalized figure in a minority community in the United States, especially in the early part of the 20th century when there was nobody writing these stories. And I mean, here I was in living in the US and finding myself in much the same position, a minority in a minority because most of them are so, Modi supporting this Bhagts. So that's a different story. Yeah. So it was it was a marginal history, and I was coming to it from a marginal position myself because I'm not a history in the informal academia. Right. So I found only places like you and Scroll, Naresh Fernandez, was
that
so
lovely column you do, the lovely
Yeah.
column you write, which is now turning into a book.
Yeah. So they had space for all these interesting histories because most of these histories actually fall out of formal, research or what is taught in classrooms or what, people recognize as formal history. And I mean, and I'm glad I got this opportunity to tell this story, which actually spans many things. A man having a double identity, sometimes flitting into becoming somebody else. And oh, did I tell you? Yes. After that book came out, I found out that his piano had emerged somewhere in some studio in Vancouver.
Bhagwan Singh's piano.
Yeah, with his initials and
gosh.
name on it, and then that he had another wife, a third wife, whose daughter, she's now in her late 70s. She saw the cover of this book and she got in touch with me and she said that Bhagwan Singh had married her mother in 1940 and she was the offspring.
God.
And this was something he kept so carefully hidden that even his formal family didn't even know about it. So this man's stories, I mean, I just can't seem to get away from. So.
Yeah, and I think you felt that even as you were doing research on him, and even when you felt that you had found out a lot about him, something new would keep popping up.
Yeah.
Yes. That sense of being on a thrilling quest sort of continues.
Yeah, and I found the other secondary stories about the Punjabis who worked as in Hollywood as turban rappers and how Bhagwan Singh also put in a stint in that. So it was all like fascinating.
Yeah, and I loved working on your book. Absolutely loved working on both the books. Just want to say that emphatically. Sehyr, I'm going to move to you next. Also because in some ways what Anu and I were talking about in some ways is resonant of the way I saw your manuscript as well, because I mean, it was such an incredible idea, and I'm so thankful to Rahul for introducing us to each other. But when you first spoke about it, my sense was, okay, this is fantastic if she can pull it off, but my gosh, it's an ambitious idea. How is she going to pull this off? So do you want to talk to our everybody listening, watching about where we were at that point? Where were you at that point? And what was the idea?
What was the idea behind it? First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's absolutely a pleasure to be in the company of literary friends. So, so it's been an amazing journey working with you, Arpita. And
thank you. Likewise.
I'm so glad that Yoda Press brought this out, and thank you so much for believing in the idea and the spirit behind the project. So I'd like to talk about the partition in general. Because, that is the main thing which was running in my mind when I came up with the idea. So I think that partition cannot be confined or placed in a specific period of time. There are events which led to it. For example, the idea of the two-nation theory was proposed and propelled much earlier, before the actual migration began. The process of migration began between June to August 1947. Similarly, there are events that continue to take place resulting from the partition, and we continue to face the implications of the partition even now till date.
Yeah.
So, I think there is a lot of literature that has been produced during the time of the partition. For example, we've all read Saadat Hasan Manto, Krishan Chandra Bedi, Amrita Pritam, to name a few, and they've massively written about the partition of India. So it is through the lens of literature that we get to see the human side of the horrors or the chaos that erupted at that time. But I somehow felt that we do have access to partition literature, but there is some sort of a gap when it comes to, especially comes to the genre of short fiction that could collectively essay the human side of the implications of the partition. So that was the main idea, because we are all experiencing the impacts. So if you look at the stories in the anthology, they all kind of try to challenge the dominant narrative of hatefulness, which kind of exists on both sides of the border. And it has its roots in in our history, which is not somehow, but which is bloodstained. So the book is a work of fiction, but at the same time, it is not completely apolitical.
Yeah.
So I would like to quote Camus here, Albert Camus, because he said that fiction is the lie through which you tell a truth. So that's how it is. So the stories in the anthology all collectively try to essay the human side of the impacts of the partition, and that was the main idea. And after the book came out, I would like to share this incident that I received. It was very surprising. I received this message from Amitabh Singh, who's the producer of, he's a filmmaker, cinematographer, and I think associated with the team of Khosla Ka Ghosla and Chiller Party. Yeah. So I got a message from him. It was very heartwarming. He said that, he reads a lot of partition literature. So he read this book, and he said that when I read Urvashi Butalia's Other Side of Silence, I was filled with grief. And, but this book has kind of ignited a little ray of hope in me.
Oh, wow.
Even if it's the small little ray of hope, I think if such, stories are trying to create a healing space, I think it does somehow serve the purpose. And it's also a very self-fulfilling experience when people get to know, people feel touched and moved reading these stories, because these are all relatable experiences.
Yeah. What was, I mean, when, of course, I had a wish list. I remember you asked me, do you have a wish list? And I was like, yeah, I have a wish list. But I know that you put a lot of thought into selecting this list of authors from both sides of the border, and to bring them together in this book, which we brought out for the 75th anniversary of the independences and partitions. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of selecting or curating this list of stories?
Yeah. So the process was very challenging. but at the same time organic.
Hmm.
Like I said earlier, I wanted to have a collection of stories that could challenge the narrative, the ongoing narrative of hate, which is
Yeah.
continuously rising on both sides, unfortunately. So there were certain ideas in my mind as well.
Hmm.
So, like, if you remember, we got some stories earlier,
Yeah.
but then we decided that, we need to kind of assign certain topics according to issues that we think are important,
Yeah.
are significant. So that's how, I thought of then, brainstorming with the authors as well, and then working around the ideas and developing them. So there's like this story that we have about the fishermen and the fishermen community between India and Pakistan.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are arrested on regular basis, and then they are the two countries have this policy of exchanging them on either on Eid or Diwali. So this is something that kind of upsets me or worries me a lot, that we do get to see a lot of media stories, but we don't have the human side of it. So this story, in a way, essayed that. Similarly, So similarly, there are other stories. For example, we have a story about the implications of nuclear weapons on the climate or on human lives, because whenever there is any skirmishes on the border, we get to see that there's a lot of trolling happening on the social media, where people are talking about now they're always ready for a war. So there are like two stories that talk about there's one dystopian story, which is like after a nuclear war has happened, and then it's by Uma, the writer who's based in Canada, Krishna.
Right.
So and the other one is by Naeem Beg, who's a Pakistani author. So both of these are around the same theme, the hazards of using nuclear weapons and why disarmament is important. So this could at least make people think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that was the exciting thing about this collection, which is that you were not just selecting, you were curating it. And that's what, made the end result so exciting. And I'll come back to you with more questions about that. But I want to move to Fehmida right now. Fehmida, you've translated this marvelous book that we are just so proud to have published. And I know we talked not so long ago for a very long time for the podcast recording. And I seem to, I asked you so many questions, and now I'm thinking I'm going to go back and ask you all the same questions again. But, all in I think it's all good if more people get to know about this marvelous book. I want to ask you specifically, obviously, I do want you to talk about particularly the experience of publishing this book. And then I want to ask you another question that springs from that. But about publishing this book, I want to remind you that when we were doing our podcast recording, you said that there were these bits in the book when you were reading the original that resonated with you in terms of your own life. And that was one of the reasons that made you reach out to Zuharadi and ask her to, let you translate her memoir. Will you talk a little more about that?
Thank you, Arpita. Thank you for having me here with, in this really lovely panel. And we talked during the podcast, and it was such a lovely experience.
Yeah, it was great fun.
Yeah. So regarding the the experience of of publishing the book. What really resonated with me, and what was heartwarming for me, was how you were so excited about the book. Once I sent it to you, and you read it, and then you immediately got back to me, and then you talked about it. I could, the sense of excitement that you showed gave me a lot of hope, and it really made me very happy to go go along with publishing with Yoda, and I'm really glad that I went along with it. Um, when I read the book, when I got this book and when I started reading it, what came to me was, there were so many things that I had experienced in my own house, like what she was writing, and it's a good 2 decades later, like in the sense Zora ma'am has chronicled the life of a Muslim household just after independence.
Yeah.
And I was not, I have not been based in Kerala till now. I was always outside Kerala. So whenever I would return home, and every vacation we would come home, and we would go to our house, which was like, like how she described, like this huge house which had so many rooms, and there was a storeroom just like how she described, and it was dark, and but it had all these lovely things inside, which would be open, maybe once a day, and my grand aunt actually would take out things and give it to the maids. So all these things resonated with me. And the kitchen, like the kitchen was this huge place where there were so many people, like the maids, different maids who would come at different times of the day, and guests who would keep coming in, and we would be making food. There would be constant activity in the kitchen. And this was also uh, as how it was in the book. And they really made me so excited, like when I was reading it, I was really excited to read that, like okay, what I experienced till now, someone has written about it. Like till then I was reading books that were chronicling lives in England, or in the US, or or in different parts of India, not of our own, of my community. And reading about it, and I really knew that I had to do the translation for this, and that's how I approached Zora ma'am, and we started talking about it. And then she said, I want you to get the flavor, the
Yeah.
flavor of the cadence of life in our community. And that's what I tried to do, like since the dialect is also different, the Malayalam is different from what is usually spoken in the rest of Kerala. She was keen that I try to incorporate that also, which also I have tried to do, and which needed a lot of collaboration with her. And that's how we worked on it.
Yeah, I also was wondering, earlier we were talking about this nature of fiction. Sehyr was mentioning what Kamu has had to say about fiction. And I remember there's this very interesting bit during our podcast recording with Zohradi that, how much is fiction, how much is auto fiction, how much is real, how much is not. And then we were discussing how a memoir is, in a sense, fiction, because what we remember, they say, is never actually how things happened. Um, was that troubling when it came to translating? I mean, did you have to, in a sense, were there moments when you went to Zohradi and you were asking her something, and there was this kind of conflict of, is this actually how it happened, or is this how I remember it? And therefore, you just have to render it faithfully. Did it cause any kind of sort of confusion for you, or did it make it more exciting?
For me, since she's already mentioning it in her preface that I don't know how much of this is fiction, and I don't know how much of this is actual, has actually happened, but I'm writing this, she writes, I'm writing this to honor the women of my community. So for me, that made sense. And I did not question, like, how did she remember all these things? Is it even possible? So what it made me do was think back on my childhood and, think what happened, and try to, dredge out some memories that way. So even when I asked her, or, when we talked about it, she always maintained that, I'll not be able to say what is fiction and what is not fiction.
Right.
I may have fictionalized because it's not possible to remember. Memory being what it is, it's not possible to remember. And a few reviewers also talked about that, saying that,
Yeah.
how a child of 5 years old remember that, all these things. Maybe it came out when she was talking to her family. Maybe these small details sometimes
Sure.
do come when we talk to
Yeah.
our family. So what it made me do was go back to my family, go back to my own larger extended family, and talk about my own childhood with them.
This
Bring
is
out,
what right.
yeah, bring out all those little details which I had forgotten, but they hadn't, and the things that I used to do as a child, and that made it very interesting for me, which I have also recorded, thinking that if I ever want to write a memoir, then I have
absolutely
it.
yeah. This is what I was getting at. I mean, I think so many of these exercises of recording or translating or documenting and collaborating are often about bearing witness in some way, and I mean, and there's another question that I want to ask you a little later about what can come out of bearing witness, Fehmida, but I'm going to move to Namita at this point, because bearing witness is what I feel she is doing in her fabulous forthcoming book, with which will be jointly published by Melbourne University Publishing and Yoda Press. And we are so honored that that she will be that she is writing this book, which is essentially chronicling the very successful farmers movement, which of course ended, well, it didn't end, but one phase of it sort of came to a certain resolution recently. And we've called the book Farmer Strike, which I'm particularly thrilled about. And I want to ask you, Namita, I mean, right now it's still, I know between you and I know it's still work in progress, but I mean, we're getting there. The manuscript is almost there and we're getting there. But I wanted to ask you, did you feel this very much, this sense of bearing witness as you were writing this? Was that an ever-present kind of sense of accountability or responsibility that you felt while you were writing this manuscript?
Yeah, thank you, Arpita. First of all, thank you for commissioning this book with Yoda Press and MUP, and I'm really happy to be here with and making new literary friends. So when I started writing this book, it was just after the pandemic and the lockdown, that period, we were still in that intermediate phase when I started thinking about writing it. And I felt I had been following the stories in the media, and some of the reporters who work with Pari, they did go into the field and they reported. I myself could not travel because of COVID restrictions. So it was mainly from the media stories and videos that one could understand and find out what's happening. But when I started thinking about writing this book, the first thing was that I need to understand this fully, if I need to write it. And nothing is going to be simple and straightforward or a linear progression kind of thing. It's going to be complex. And with the earlier experience of writing a novel, and doing this non-fiction book for the first time on a very, on a similar topic of, farmers, agrarian crisis, etc. So I knew that I have to go to the farmers protest sites and speak to farmers, and it couldn't be just trying to figure out by understanding research papers and other books on the topic. So when I went and met the farmers there, I think that is when it really started sort of falling into place in my mind, that I need to understand the different stories of these farmers, because there are different kinds of farmers, different based on their land holdings. There are small and marginal farmers, and there are landless laborers, and there are bigger farmers and middle-level farmers. And what has their life been before this farmers' protest? Because it wasn't something which just happened overnight. The agrarian crisis has been going on in our country for so many years, and a lot of others have written about it. Not a lot, some others have written about it, like P. Sainath and Jaideep Hardikar and Kota Nilima, and more recently Kavita Iyer have written books. And all of them are, Kota has written some fiction books, but most of the others are non-fiction, reportage and books, etc. But this was different in the sense that it had to be accessible to the general reader. So what I'm trying to attempt here is try to understand it in a way and write it in a way that others like me would understand it, because I'm not someone who has been a trained professional journalist. I have not even been a trained writer. I mean, I came into this field because I started writing my novel for some reason in 2008 or 9. And farmers made their way into that book. It started as a story of a social worker, and then who goes into the villages and meets farmers, and farmers made their way into the book, and it became The Long March. And I wrote that book before the actual what is called the Long March happened in 2018. The Nasik to Mumbai, which happened in March 2018. And my novel was published in October 2018. Subsequent to that was another farmers' protest in Delhi, which was again in November 2018. And which happened after my book was published. And I was a little overwhelmed, at witnessing something which is similar to what I had written in my book, but
in your fiction, which you had fictionalized, something that's coming.
Which I had fictionalized, and which was now happening in a broader and wider way, much more than what I had imagined. And so when I'm writing this non-fiction book about farmers' protests, I wanted to be sure that, all the aspects of agriculture which affect the farmers and which push them into protesting get covered in this book. And when I was researching, I realized that historically farmers have always had to protest. Peasants have always had to protest and demand for their rights, and only then they would get what they deserve. So I guess bearing witness to their lived reality, their experienced their experiences, and writing it in a way that tells us why they had to protest and why they continued protesting for over a year. In fact, at that time when they were approaching a year of those protests, most of them were saying that if the laws are not repealed, we'll go on for another year. And everyone knew that this would be such a difficult proposition, but they were already ready to go on for another year. And when the laws were repealed, they sort of proved that, okay, if you do strike, if you do protest, the authorities, the government will listen to you, and they will have to do something to listen to you and to take action.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I want to put one question to all of you, which kind of I feel will get all of you to talk about what I wanted to put to you all individually, because I know we're running out of time. You all sort of write across genres in a sense. I mean, you are as comfortable in a sense in non-fiction as in fiction, or even within fiction across genres. Fehmida, you translate. Sehyr, I know you are as fabulous with your reportage and more activist kind of writing. Do you take from one to the other? Do you take from one genre to the other, or do you have to shut the other genre out when you write? I'm going to start with Anu. Anu, what about you? You're on mute, Anu. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah. One basic thing is the kind of research that I have to do for my non-fiction pieces and for the scroll essays and for the book that I did with you and Bhagwan Singh. That research always helps me in the fiction I write, because in the hottest summer in years is set in a very strange, an interesting period in world history. It's just after the Second World War. And this is about a man who's a German born in South Africa. So he came with his own history, and then he's transported to Central India. So I had to read up a lot on history, even if it could not show it on the page.
It's sort of the backstory. The history is like a backstory.
Yeah, to give his character and the context a certain authenticity. So I always find I have to bring in that research and history itself into a lot of my fictional work. And then, of course, I write.
Because that is your particular interest, and you don't think it stands in the way of writing that.
No, I just love history and research and going deep into the archives. And I'm so glad I found an editor and publisher in you. So that's the best possible thing ever. Yeah.
Okay. Sehyr, what about you? When you're writing fiction, you said earlier that, there is the personal and the political, there's the fiction and there's a non-fiction. For me, frankly, the personal is political always. That is what I live by. But I of course, you might have a different take on that. Do you have to leave the activism aside when you are writing your fiction, or do you feel one somehow influences the other?
Yeah. So I think in my case, it's not intentional. It's kind of organic. The process is organic, and I think the subconscious mind has a very significant role to play in my writing. All of us, we grow up listening to stories from our grandparents. In my case, I've spent the most cherished moments of my childhood listening to stories from my grandmother. And all of these are still so vivid in my memory. So my grandmother was born and brought up in Kota, Rajasthan. And the memories from her hometown during the pre-partition times used to be my bedtime stories. And my mind would, visualize how she would narrate her experiences or her memories from the pre-partition times. And these would take me to an unlived era and an unknown period, and would kind of, sort of fascinate me in many creative ways. So I think this is what creatively motivates me, her memories, because I work in the area of intergenerational trauma, nostalgia, migration. So all of it, I think it is the combination of both. Activism comes from there, writing comes from there. I get this push from the experiences or the memories of the times of partition that I've heard from my grandmother, and I've seen the anguish of it and the sorrow of it through her eyes. So in my case, it's like that because my areas are very, very, very specific.
Yeah, absolutely. Fehmida, when you translate, do you lock something up that would otherwise be at play when you're writing your fiction? Because I know you write fiction as well. You're on mute, Fehmida. Huh.
Yeah, my fiction and my translation, it's not connected, but what I do, like my non-fiction, whatever I do, the articles that I write or what I read, that is from where I get my ideas for my fiction. Like it might not be just one instance that I'm taking and using in my fiction. It could be a collection of things that I have read, and I take things from each of that, and that's how my fiction is based on non-fiction. Is I consider myself more of a non-fiction writer. Like that comes naturally to me, and fiction is something that I have to think about, and I have to research. Like Anu said, I really have to research and find out whether I'm giving I'm making any mistake, or I mean, it has to be rooted in research. So my fiction is definitely influenced by the non-fiction that I do. Yeah.
Right. Anu actually didn't talk about one of the things that she does, which is also write for children. So that's actually like a third register, isn't it, Anu?
Yeah. Yes. I mean,
how do you decide what tonality, what vocabulary you must use when you're writing as Aditi K or not?
yeah, I have to imagine myself as a different person, I think. But I think I used to write more for children at an early part of my writing career, and I mean, this is going to get very complicated. But I thought I used to find myself locked in a box if I did too much of children's literature, because that's actually a very it's a very small, very poorly defined market in India.
India.
Yeah. So I found that Aditi K is more. It's the books that I write as Aditi K transcends all age groups. But the specific books for young readers, I was sometimes pulled up by my editors at Hachette and Penguin that it sounds a bit too much for adults. But if I'm writing non-fiction for children, how much if I'm writing about, say, independence or something related to history, truly, how much can you? I always have been dealing with this dilemma. How much can you think? How much do you think that young readers should be exposed to? And I honestly always felt that young readers are more perceptive and intelligent than we give them credit for.
Absolutely.
And
100%.
Yeah, and
I think we underestimate them a lot, and I think
quite so.
editors and publishers have this very formulaic, very moral code driven idea of what they think should be part of children's books or young adult books, which is all being busted by the young people themselves online.
Yes. Yeah. So whenever I'm writing for young people, there's always this censor who's looking over my shoulder and saying that I should be correct, I should not put in this aspect. So it's a dilemma I'm constantly grappling with. Whereas in the work that I'm always trying to do for older readers, it's more free flowing and spontaneous. So there's this dichotomy that I'm constantly grappling with.
Yeah. Namita, for you, of course, I came to you because of your fiction. I mean, so you're like a case in point about fiction flowing into non-fiction. I mean, had I not read The Long March, I would not have sought you out and said, please write this book for us, because there was something, I mean, which I felt about your voice in the first book. And I wanted that voice to tell me about the farmers' movement in the second book. Does that make any sense to you at all? I mean, Or were
Yeah.
you flabbergasted absolutely when?
I was overwhelmed because I think this non-fiction book about the farmers' protest, it's quite a challenge, and it is an exciting challenge now that I've gone worked through a major portion of the manuscript. But
Yeah, it's almost ready. So now there's no turning back. Yeah.
Wow.
of course not, no. But in the fiction book, so when my premise initially was very small, where the social worker works with farmers, and the farmers became a much bigger portion of the book gradually as I started writing. And I realized that, okay, now I need to find out more about them. And I started researching. And I also visited a farmer household. Now, there's one particular family I visited, and that lady, she's no longer alive. She died a few years ago. So when I visited their house, and I have described that in my fiction book, and in the corner of that, it's a very small house. It's just like one room, it's a very small house with just one room and a small partition to separate the kitchen from the living room. In the corner of the living room, I visualized Vikram Sonare, who's a character in my fiction book. Now she had only one son. Vikram Sonare is the second younger son who I imagined and who becomes a character in the book. But now, whenever I think of them, Vikram Sonare is a real person for me, and I have to remind myself, okay, he wasn't there. She had only one son. This is some I have created, But when I remember the house, I see him standing there in the corner as the full-grown young man that he is in the book. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is when I'm working on this manuscript. Initially, it was very frustrating. Like oh God, this is nonfiction. I can't make up stuff here. So at every point, you have to verify. You have to make sure that it's correct. So that's a big difference. And I think now I'm enjoying I'm fantasizing about writing another fiction book as I complete this.
As you get to the end of this.
Yeah, and I'm enjoying this experience. Although initially I was overwhelmed, but yeah, it's a very, very heartening and enjoyable experience.
Wonderful. I know Sabine is going to come put her screen on very soon, because I know she'll be keeping her eye on the time. But as we are wrapping up, can we just go down the screen, and will you all give our viewers or whoever connects later and watches this later, whatever, some 2 book recommendations based on something you're reading right now? Who wants to go first? Sehyr? You're on mute.
Yeah. So like I, earlier quoted Albert Camus. So I'm kind of I was going through this phase of an existentialist dread, So it happens often to all of us. So I was reading a lot of Camus these days. So I just finished reading Exile and Kingdom, which I would really recommend. So, and then I'll move on to The Fall. So I'm going to
wonderful.
Trying to complete all of his works, and very passionately.
Okay, so something very classical from you. Great. I mean, classics. Anyone who was Anu? You want to go next?
Yeah, I was reading this book by this Australian writer, Fiona McFarlane. The Sun Comes Down. It's about it's set in Australia. A young boy suddenly gets lost, and it's about the reactions of the small colony in which he lives to that disappearance. So it's it's a historical fiction set in the mid-19th century. And the second one I just picked up, it's by this historian Namita Das on courtly encounters, the early days of the East India Company, and
Oh yeah, this one.
how it sets about things were so in so much flux and chaotic in that mid 18th century period, and it's astonishing how a small company managed to build an empire out of all the vicissitudes and everything that was in India at that time. So yeah, I've just begun that. So yeah. So can I add one more thing?
Yes.
It's not a recommendation, but it's just a kind of small appreciation. It's when Namita said that you had read her book, The Long March. That's one thing I found very refreshing and about you, is that you look for your authors in the most unexpected places. They're not the people who are the celebrity writers or anything, and that's what I find very heartwarming and encouraging about you, that because none of the books that I have written, the recent 2 books, would have been picked up by any mainstream publisher, but you did. So I'm really grateful to you for that.
Thank you, Anu. I love working on your book. As far as Namita's book is concerned, it's one of the first books I read when the lockdown started, just before the lockdown, I think. And it gave me such a sense of hope. And because I was going a little crazy at that time, I was a nervous wreck, as many of us were, I think. And I don't know, I mean, the book was, one of the most soothing, healing, and hopeful voices I had read in a really long time. And Namita and I had met a few times over the years, mostly at JLF. And I just pretty much cold called her, I think, and said, okay, this has to happen. So, I mean, a lot of it is serendipity, really, I think. But moving on to Fehmida, what are you reading right now, and anything you want to recommend for the people who might be listening to this?
I just finished reading Anukriti Upadhyay's collection of stories, The Blue Woman.
Right.
And yeah, I really recommend Anukriti's. I really love her writing. I love the atmosphere that she creates, and the way she incorporates nature and all that into her writing. So definitely Anukriti's books, and also Anger of Saintly Men by Anubha Yadav.
Right. Yeah.
Collection of connected stories. It's a beautiful book, and
wonderful. That's a lovely book.
Yeah,
absolutely. So lovely recommendations. Namita?
So I've been reading mostly for researching my current fiction.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
But there's one book which I want to go back to and read it completely, and which I would recommend others because it's written so well. It's called Cadillac Desert, the American West and its Disappearing Water. It's written by Mark Reisner, and this is not a new book. It was written in the 1980s, but it tells you how in the US they diverted and dammed huge rivers like the Colorado and Columbia and a few others, and how the water flowed through aqueducts, and it supplied water to states which were like complete deserts, California, Idaho, Arizona, and they made them livable. But also it's like, what the author quotes, it's like what they created was an Eden, but an Eden that may be only a mirage. How all this process, it's a history of the reckless depletion of the water
that's
resources.
a very interesting book. As a matter of fact, my theme this semester is environmentalism, Desi style. So I'm constantly looking for readings for my students. This sounds very interesting.
It was.
But I asked you for 2 recommendations.
Yeah, so I have only one right now. The second one, which I would recommend is the latest book by P. Sainath. Freedom Fighters. Yeah, that's a book which I'm reading. So yeah,
which everyone should read, absolutely. Yeah,
everyone should read. Yeah.
Excellent.
Last Heroes, Stories of the Freedom Fighters.
Right. So, Sabine, this has been fabulous. You gave me such a great opportunity to just chat with these marvelous authors, whom I also consider my friends and well-wishers of Yoda Press. And thank you for this opportunity. It really means the world for, a small press like ours, because we don't always get visibility in mainstream spaces, and you always remember us for your lovely, lovely event, which has really started bringing in so many different and fantastic themes and voices, and the kind of convergences that I can see happening. This is my third panel, so I think I can speak to that. And as you said earlier, when we were on the previous panel, if there is some way for you to turn it into a hybrid show, my gosh, I'll be the first one to reach them.
I will,
Hold me to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Hold me to it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arpita, and the amazing, amazing panel. You're a trailblazing publisher, Arpita. So it's my selfish, dream that comes true every year. So the pleasure, honestly, is all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Please do stay in touch.
Thank you, Kumar.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.